Hi there, I'm Kate McClellan, and I've been a professional wedding planner for over 20 years now. I started Planning Collective when I noticed that though most couples are super excited about getting engaged, they quickly feel overwhelmed and intimidated by the actual process of planning their weddings. If left unchecked, this can lead to massive burnout and the urge to scrap all your plans and just elope. While this is totally normal, you don't have to sacrifice your sanity for your dream wedding. In the Wedding Planning Collective podcast, I'm going to share the processes, tips, and tools that all engaged couples like you need to feel confident, supported, and excited about your wedding plans again. Let's get started. Hey there, before we get to the episode, I have a quick question for you. Have you been unsuccessfully trying to shake that feeling that you're forgetting something when it comes to your wedding? You've got the Knot app and you've downloaded countless other planning checklists, but you just can't get rid of that sneaking suspicion that there's something you don't know yet. It's a very common feeling when it comes to wedding planning. So much so that I decided to put together a free resource to help get rid of what I call FOWO, the fear of wedding oversight. Yes, it does include that 12-month task checklist, but that's just the start. In addition to the ultimate wedding planning checklist, my new Don't Forget list also includes a wedding vendor checklist, your shopping list, a packing list for the wedding weekend, and a complete wedding item setup list to make sure that you are truly not forgetting anything when it comes to your wedding. And you heard me right, this list is free for you to grab right now. Just head over to planningcollective.com/forgetting and it's all yours. That's planningcollective.com/FORGETTING, and let's get rid of that FOWO together. All right, let's get on to the episode. All right, welcome to our fourth video in this 5-part series where we are going to dig into pillar number 3, your guest list. Now, I promise, we are getting so close to the point where you can start doing some of the fun stuff. And you will be so happy that you put in all of this work at the front end so that you can breeze through the rest of the planning process because you have such a strong foundation. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. Please make sure that you pop back over to episode 112 where we started this series, as one step really does build upon the next in the series. So far, we've reviewed the common and expensive wedding planning mistakes that so many couples make, and I don't want you to be a part of that group. We talked about the accounts that you'll want to have set up prior to reaching out to any of your vendors. And we also covered the first 2 pillars of your wedding planning foundation, that is your priorities and your budget. Today, we're moving on to the guest list. Now, your guest list might not feel like it would be super crucial to the wedding plans, but it most definitely is. Remember that analogy comparing wedding planning to building your home? Skipping the guest list portion would be like ordering your lumber without knowing how big the house is going to be. So much of the wedding cost is based on the number of guests you'll have, and many venue options will be based on your overall count. So grab your workbook. You can find it over at planningcollective.com/blueprint if you're not already signed up. And let's get started. I'll often call today's topic a lesson on picking your battles. For some, working on your guest list might be an easy task. You know exactly who's going to be on that invite list. There aren't any crazy fine lines to draw or family dynamics that you need to take into consideration. For others, though, you need to pick your battles and look at the big picture of life beyond the wedding when it comes to who makes the cut for their wedding guest list. And I'd love to share an example here from a client that we worked with many years ago. So the bride had initially wanted a smaller wedding. She didn't want to have a huge, big ordeal, but she knew that it was really important to her future mother-in-law, and they had a huge family. Earlier in their relationship, the bride and her future mother-in-law had some tension. They didn't really get along, and they had really worked hard to build a good relationship, and they were in a great place before the wedding. And in this case, the bride decided that she was going to let her mother-in-law have this one and not restrict the number of guests that she would invite for the sake of their relationship after the wedding. She knew how important it was to her, and they were helping to pay for the wedding. So it was worth it to her to have the bigger wedding than they initially wanted to keep the peace and make sure that everything was fine once the wedding was over and done with. Now, I will say I'm typically a huge advocate for couples standing their ground when it comes to things like their wedding size and others' opinions. But with most things in life, there are certain situations where it's just not going to be worth it in the long run if it's going to create huge issues. This was one of those examples. I know in the past I've had clients that have had a flipped situation than the bride. They held their ground and kept the guest list to what they initially planned for, and the family eventually got on board and everything was fine. The point is, you really need to think about your specific wants, priorities, and family dynamics when it comes to your wedding guest list. Pick your battles carefully if necessary. All right, that little disclaimer aside, let's get into how you create your guest list to begin with. As with just about everything else in wedding planning, we're going back to pillar one again, talking about your priorities. What did you decide when you were talking about the size of your wedding? Did you want to have a micro, intimate, small, medium, or huge wedding? The amount of guests that you're going to invite is definitely going to have an immediate impact on not only your budget, but of course the venues or locations that are available to you based on the approximate size of your guest list. And a quick side note that's important to keep in mind at this point, we're talking about the estimated number of guests that you're going to invite. We're not looking for an exact guest count at this point. Most couples don't have a final or official guest count until a few weeks before the wedding. So just keep that in mind, as I know it is tempting to want to have that official number much earlier in the process. And in the membership, I get more into why you don't want to send out your invites or RSVPs too early. So make sure you're staying tuned for that. But again, we're talking about general numbers at this point. Your venue and other vendors are going to be very familiar with getting these initial estimates. So they know you're not locking into a very specific number, but you'll need to know about how many guests you're going to invite so that you know if your venue is large enough, too small, and about what you're going to budget for. The general rule is that about 20% of the guests invited will not be able to attend. So if you invite 100 guests, you can anticipate about 80 will be able to attend. Now, this number can vary greatly, of course, depending on many details of the wedding. I found that smaller guest counts, like under 60 or so, you tend to have a much smaller percentage of guests declining. Because if you're only inviting those close family and friends, they're more likely to do whatever they have to make it to that wedding, right? But if you're inviting a larger guest count, some of the guests that you're maybe not as close to won't be able to make it, and you're going to see the declines might be closer to that 20% rate. The other two factors that often impact this number is if your wedding is being held on or around a holiday weekend, or if there's significant travel that's going to be involved for a majority of the guests. Either of these situations often mean that you'll have a higher number of guests that are unable to make it, but that's not always the case. For example, if you have a lot of family or friends that all live out of state and you have a wedding around the holidays when they're all home, you may have more guests that would be able to attend than they would have if you had it outside of the holiday season. Okay, getting back on track here though. The point is that it's really important that you have a basic guest list decided before you start reaching out to venues and definitely before you book anything. Remember, you don't want to be stuck planning backwards by making a decision or commitments and then being forced to adjust your budget or other details to accommodate things that were not your priority to begin with. Once you've decided on the approximate size, how do you come up with the actual guest list? Well, I recommend you grab a glass of wine or maybe a bottle of wine, a cup of tea, or your favorite spindrift, and just sit down and start jotting down names. Start with your immediate family, your wedding party, and close family, friends, and work your way down. If you have any friends or family who have recently gotten married, or maybe had a graduation party or another large event, reach out to them and see if you can get a copy of their guest list. This will help make sure that you're not missing anyone, and it'll also help you get a jump start on collecting addresses. And this is where your Google Drive is going to start coming in handy by using Google Sheets. If you haven't used it before, it's like a live online version of Excel that you can share with your family and friends, and they can help collect addresses for you by just simply entering them into the document on their own. You can text or email the link to your guests, and they can add in their addresses directly to the document. Outside of the guest brain dump, there are two questions that I often see come up when it comes to the wedding guest list. The first is, do we invite kids? Now, I find that the answer to this in most cases is a pretty fast yes or no. Either it's super common in your family to have kids attend, or your family prefers an adult only reception, and the parents will make arrangements for their kids on their own. There's really no right or wrong answer. Do what feels best for you. It is your wedding after all. If you do have quite a few guests that have little ones and they might have an issue with childcare, say they're traveling out of state, or what happens a lot is all of their go to babysitters are also going to be at the wedding, you can arrange to have a sitter on site at the venue or at the hotel to make sure that the parents can enjoy the reception. I typically see that parents are grateful for an excuse for a night out, especially if there is an open bar. The second question is, who gets a plus one or a date? Now, the formal rule is that spouses, fiancés, and live in partners should be included as a guest on the invitation. You'll most likely have some guests that are in long term relationships, but maybe not living together or engaged. It will probably be assumed that their significant other is going to be included too, regardless of the official status of their relationship. My personal opinion is that all adult members of the wedding party and immediate family should also be invited with a guest, regardless of their relationship status. But again, every family is different and the dynamics are different, as well as your budget and your venue restrictions. If your budget and space allows for it, it's not uncommon to extend a plus one to all adult guests. Now, the primary guests will know that they're invited with a date by the way that you address the wedding invitation. If you know the significant other's name, you would include that on the envelope for the invitation. If you're unsure of the relationship or the name, you can just simply write "and guest" on the envelope. Whatever your decision is on the topic of kids and plus ones, you're most likely going to get some guests that disagree with you or want to share their opinions with you. For whatever reason, these two areas can be really divisive, again, regardless of what you decide. So try not to take it personally if you get pushback in either direction. Stick to your priorities, stick to your guns, and know that you're making these decisions for a reason. Once you've done your brain dump of potential guests, take a look at how that count compares with your preferred wedding size. Ideally, they're going to match up perfectly, but most likely you're going to need to either make some cuts or separate the guest list into an A list and a B list. It's relatively common practice, but I do want to share a couple words of caution if you are going to have a secondary or a B list. If you're sending out save the dates, only send them out to those that you know 100% will receive a wedding invitation. If a guest receives a save the date, they are going to save the date and potentially start making arrangements and plans to attend the wedding. This would include kids and dates. If you have a B list or you're unsure at this point if they're going to have family, kids, or a date, do not include them in the save the date. You can send an invitation to someone that did not receive a save the date, but it's definitely considered rude to send someone a save the date that you don't end up inviting to the wedding. Again, the save the date doesn't have to be a final version. You can always include more people from the save the date round, but don't send anyone a save the date if they're not 100% on that list. Secondly, if you plan on having a B list, you'll want to send out your first round of invitations on the early side. I would say 8 to 10 weeks before the wedding, as opposed to the normal 6 to 8 weeks that I would recommend. This way, you can send out a second round early enough so the guests can make arrangements to attend and it doesn't feel like they were invited last minute. If you're able to do so, make sure the second round of invitations has an RSVP due date that's like a week or so later than the others that were given. If someone receives an invitation to a wedding and it's like a week after the requested RSVP due date has passed, they're going to know that they were part of that B list. And one final tip for engaged couples when it comes to the guest list: stop making friends. No new clubs, no new hobbies or jobs until after the wedding. I'm kidding, of course, mostly, but it can be challenging when you meet new people after you've been engaged that you really want to include in the wedding. If you or your fiance are the type of people that like to pick up strays, as a past client once said, make sure that you leave a little bit of room in that guest list to budget for some of those that you might add that you just haven't met yet. All right, you have some homework to do now. Once you have your brain dump of names down, you'll be ready for the fifth and final pillar, your checklists and timelines. If you're listening to the podcast and you don't want to wait another week for the final episode, make sure you visit planningcollective.com/blueprint for the full wedding planning blueprint preview series.